Thank you so much for tuning into our webinar titled The Great Unwokening, Have Hyper-Femininity and Masculinity Divided a Generation? So some big questions that we're going to be tackling today. My name is Marina Graham. So I'm the Cultural Insights and Trends Director at MTM. And today I'm joined by my colleague and Associate Director, Alex Gibson. Give us a wave. And our trusted Gen Z collaborator, Holly Friend. And I'm also very excited to introduce you to our expert panelists. So we've got Emma Glenn Baker and Jay Richards. So Emma is the creator of the Star Girl podcast, which is a show about self-image, celebrity culture, and embodiment. And Jay is the co-founder and CEO of Gen Z consultancy, Imaging Insights. So a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. We've held time at the end of today's session for Q&A, so please leave your questions in the chat. The full report and recording of this webinar will be available from the 9th of July, so next Tuesday, and we'll send you all an email that day with the links to access both of these. So keep an eye out. Okay. I don't know if we should wait a little bit for people to join, but I think let's just dive in. So in this webinar today, we're going to explore the surprising shift in Gen Z's approach to gender. So while they're known as the most progressive generation yet, whose woke politics have pushed the boundaries of identity and dismantled gender norms, Gen Z may actually be a lot more traditional than you may think. So what inspired this research? This is a fairly overwhelming slide with a lot of headlines, which hopefully make the point that we're trying to make. But at the beginning of this year, we saw a flood of alarming headlines and statistics about the growing gender gap among young people. So as you can see, the narrative has been largely negative, and it felt quite one-sided. So as cultural strategists, we wanted to sort of get into this and uncover what was really going on behind these headlines. So in short, we're not here to reinforce the moral panic surrounding gender or the good-bad dichotomy that exists in the 2024 media landscape, but to offer a positive, albeit realistic outlook on the future of gender for Gen Z. So in terms of today, we're going to be giving you a sneak peek of what's in store in our full report, but we'll also be tapping into the expertise of our team and panelists to get you up to speed with what may seem like a cultural step backwards. So the methodology. So before we get into the good stuff, we wanted to just give you a quick overview of what we did. So we combined cultural immersion, expert interviews, and Gen Z interviews to get a real understanding of the drivers that's accelerating the so-called generational gender war. A big thing that we were really focused on was making sure that we got a diversity of sort of voices and perspectives in this. So we didn't want to just speak to men and women who sort of expressed or supported one version of masculinity or femininity. We wanted to speak to people who are living different experiences and who had different views on how they express their gender. So the majority of the work in this space so far has focused exclusively on either masculinity or femininity in isolation, which means it's missed how these two things are interrelated. So we wanted to take sort of a different approach to this and look at the common threads and forces that are driving these hyper extremes, as well as how they manifest in trends. So the report takes the form of a timeline from 2020 to 2027. Holly, can you talk us through the decision to structure the report through these 3 eras?
No problem. Yeah, so when we set out to start this report at the beginning of the year, we were really keen to have some sort of timeline or flow or narrative to the report, because I think it's really easy when brands or just individuals are kind of tackling what's happening in gender today, reading all these type of, headlines that Marina showed a few minutes ago, or even just having conversations at the pub or at the dinner table about what's happening in terms of gender, because it's something that everyone really has an opinion on and feels quite strongly about. It's really easy to feel like there was this kind of cultural chaos going on. So we're really keen to have a bit of a narrative to kind of guide people through and show that there is this kind of common thread, or there are these behavioral similarities that are happening as the generation kind of ages and gets older, and kind of reacts to what's happening in society around them. So I've actually worked in a lot of Gen Z research trends since the mid 2010s, going into the late 2010s. And when we look at this period, which, as you can see in the then section, kind of lasted until the early 2020s as well, the conversation around Gen Z and gender was really about resisting norms. It was this sense of resistance. There was a lot of conflict, there was a lot of tension. This was also a really positive time in terms of gender too. We had, a lot more inclusivity, a lot more freedom of gender expression. It was a great time for LGBTQ plus rights, for example. And also we think of things like drag being a big cultural moment during this period. We had makeup, nail polish for men. We had STEM for women. We really felt like it was about kind of pushing boundaries, and it felt like gender was becoming a lot more fluid. But there was also this sense of this kind of we were living in the shadow of things like the Me Too movement, and it felt like masculinity felt broken, and women were kind of pitted to save society or save the world. If this sounds like a lot of kind of cultural moments we're referencing, we are going to dig into this in a lot more detail later down the line, don't worry. And also in the report, we have a lot more details on this too. But it really was a time of identity politics that we now think of as woke culture. And within MTM, we had a really interesting conversation the other day where we were talking about how this period really created a lot of expectations of how gender should be, quote unquote, expressed. And so anything that actually sat outside of that felt anti-progressive, or kind of going against this progression that we had, the millennial generation and the older Gen Zs had kind of created. And that in itself created this kind of gender divide that pitted men and women against each other. There was a lot of kind of men hating going on, and also men going their own way, and kind of forms of misogyny happening online in the manosphere, which again, we're going to cover later on. But that sense of gender divide really leads us to the period that we're in today, where it feels like young men and women are actually kind of resisting the resistance in their own way by actually retreating to the familiar, or what feels kind of comfortable. So that's where we see the more traditional codes of gender reappear again. So many people on this call might have seen the rise of trad wives, the rise of men kind of forming the ideal of the protector again, these kind of alpha ideals. Again, we're going to come back to this later. So that forms the now section. And then when we look ahead, we really wanted to have a future part of the report where we could start to predict some trends, kind of formulate our opinion on what we see for the future of Gen Z gender. And what we see as the answer is this sense of alliance, this sense that Gen Z want to, and they are showing that they desire this sense of bridging the gap between the genders that we've created over the years, and form this kind of alliance that could help to solve this crisis of meaning, this crisis of belonging and intimacy that we've found ourselves in. So this is where in the report we start to unpack some of the key recommendations, the ways that brands can actually enter this space, because this is obviously a huge topic. So that kind of gives you an idea of the timeline, the narrative, and yeah, it would be great to dig into some of the trends with the experts.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. And I do think that last point is a really sort of key point for us, is that we do want to create, we have created implications and sort of recommendations that do point towards a more hopeful, unified future. It feels like a lot of the focus has just been around this sort of panic of the divide, but actually there's a lot of hope to come. So in the full report, we've reported on specific trends in the then, now, and next section. Today, we're just going to give you a quick overview of each, and then have a discussion around each sort of category. So these are the then trends. So obviously, we don't want to spend too much time on these because they're then and they're over, but it did feel quite important to touch on them because it's so hugely important to understand these in order to really grasp what's going on now and what's going to come in the future. So a big thing with sort of the then stuff is it was all around how the discourse was rife with lazy messages about empowerment, toxic masculinity, and a so-called sex recession that aggravated this gender divide. So I'm going to take a break now from showing the slides and show our beautiful panelists while we talk through the then stuff. So let's start with Emma. So you explore the cultural state of femininity on your podcast. Can you explain what tropes or trends are no longer relevant to Gen Z femininity and maybe tell us a little bit about why?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Marina. Yes, so just again, I'm Emma. I run a podcast called Stargirl, where I explore lots of these themes that we're talking about today. So in regards to your question, and as the previous slide kind of just spoke to, there's, I think, three progressions that are all related that we can talk to. So those would be the death of the girl boss, girl culture, and then as the folks at MTM kind of neatly categorized, this messy millennial girl boss, which kind of puts them all together. So to talk about the girl boss specifically, we know that the death of the girl boss was like declared in 2021. So this is rejecting all of this kind of squeaky clean corporatized feminism that Marina was just alluding to with these lazy calls for empowerment, getting women into the workplace, getting them to the top of the corporate ladders, really just replacing traditional male business roles with women, right? And so there's a number of reasons why that started to feel not quite right. One, I think just aesthetically, as I mentioned, the like squeaky clean corporateness, totally non-sensual. And if we think of like the D2C branding that's happening in that time, late 2010s, early 2020s, things like Glossier, The Wing, Outdoor Voices, all of these brands that are kind of heralded as like the quintessential brands of that time, just all felt very robotic, very techy, very non-sensual, as I said. The other thing is that, to Marina's point about lazy calls for empowerment, people kind of started to realize that, you know, just replacing traditional male roles with women isn't going to necessarily equalize, bring about change, whatever, in the ways that they thought we might be able to. So to the earlier point about resisting traditional institution structures, et cetera, there was much more, or there was a realization that if we want to change what's going on, that has to be at a structural level, not just inserting new characters into like old structures that maybe don't result in the most harmony or most good vibes overall. So that's that one. What followed then is girl culture, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Things like
2023 was the girl of the year, the year of the girl.
exactly, Year of the Girl, exactly, in 2023. So girl culture, or excuse me, girl math, girl dinner. I think huge emblems of that time are like the Barbie core, everything that goes into that, Eras Tour, Taylor Swift. So this huge, I guess, revitalization of girl gang, being a girl's girl, and just being a girl. So both hyper feminine and critically very youthful. So this is rejecting the corporate girl boss thing, but still maintaining a lot of that almost at times indulgent youthfulness, right? So really resisting any sort of responsibility, be that in relationships, in job, in finances, etc. And that, I guess, I think we'll get into it when we move to the now, but as we can probably anticipate, that starts to feel kind of tired and empty as well. So these both two things unite in, I think, the third thing that I mentioned, the messy millennial girl boss, which was taking both, rejecting both of those at an extreme and claiming financial instability, so fine. Hot mess party girl, so fine. If you think of the illustration style that was very popular of these kind of like cutesy girl in her bedroom in her underwear with maybe, well, a houseplant in the back, a disco ball, pizza boxes on the floor, weed paraphernalia, a cat stretched out, that sort of just like messy, extended adolescence where there's no responsibility and there's also no consequences. I think all of those things we can place in the then category.
Yeah, perfect. And I think what's something that's really interesting with that too is how a lot of these things became aesthetics in their own right, which we're going to talk about going forward as well in the now, but how that's also a sort of testament about how it didn't lead to progress or any actual change. It just became, as you said, Emma, this like persona and sort of aesthetic that you adopted to fit into a certain sort of category of girlhood or femininity. So Alex, we made a very conscious decision at the start of this project to avoid terms like toxic masculinity. So can you tell us a little bit about why this was?
Yeah, thanks, Marina. So, I mean, we will use the term toxic masculinity, but not in a sincere way. So, I think
We always do
we
this.
point, yeah, yeah. Remind me each time. So, I mean, we pointed to a few headlines on one of the opening slides around the gender divide, and I think, we've seen also some quite sort of shocking headlines about masculinity in the last few years, probably going back sort of 6, 7 years in total. So we had the New Yorker saying, "What's the matter with men?" We've had the Washington Post saying men are lost. We've had the New York Times saying, "Is masculinity in crisis?" even in the last year or so. And all of this is bound in this kind of concept of toxic masculinity. But really, we found it to be quite an unhelpful term because it's come to mean so many different things to so many different people and encapsulate so much of sort of modern masculine behavior. And we noticed that it was starting to be kind of overused in discourse. It was starting to be parodied in mainstream discourse, which is normally a sign that you need to kind of reframe these conversations. And it was starting to become synonymous with just the idea of kind of lifting weights or being part of a sports club, and kind of the meaning had lost all purpose essentially. And at the same time as kind of some of the trends from the kind of feminine perspective that Emma has talked around, this was having a direct impact on men as well. So Marina, you mentioned we spoke to kind of real Gen Z for this study, and and often those that ran in some of the same circles that we deem kind of problematic in the media. So for example, young Gen Zs who are seeing Andrew Tate content online. So we made another conscious decision in our report not to kind of name Andrew Tate because he is just kind of one kind of manifestation of a broader problem, and also kind of a lot of the narratives around him have lacked the kind of nuance to really dig into what the drivers are underpinning his appeal. And so speaking to these real Gen Z, we were hearing the impact of kind of girl boss phrases of kill all men, and how this was obviously quite quite an alienating concept to young Gen Z men, and how some of the positives of feminism of the last sort of 5-10 years have started to kind of be misinterpreted by these young men. And we do see the headlines around kind of large swathes of young men are watching Andrew Tate content. And no doubt he's a kind of hugely dangerous individual, and there are concerns around kind of the conservatism of young Gen Z men. So there was a poll out just yesterday that said that, at least for our kind of UK audience, if the 16 and 17-year-old men had the vote right now, they would be voting for Reform UK in equal numbers to Labour as well. So there's definitely kind of issue there in terms of they're veering to the right. But at the same time, there was a really interesting quote actually from a guy called William Costello on a podcast I listened to recently. He's a PhD student at the University of Austin and specializing in masculinity. And he said that self-development to be a better partner and achieve romantic success can't automatically equate to misogyny. And if we don't have anything to say about that very important thing that matters to men, then Andrew Tate will have something to say. So, and that's kind of the crux of it. A lot of this kind of the drivers for young men and of kind of their desires to watch content about young masculinity. A lot of it is what we would actually see as quite inoffensive. It's about self-improvement, self-development. And that becomes kind of a rabbit hole that obviously gets deeper and deeper and has these kind of problematic consequences at the end of it. But, I think it's also a story about the kind of passivity of modern media consumption. So when we were speaking to these young Gen Z, they were saying, yeah, I do see kind of Andrew Tate videos on TikTok, but it's often around kind of fitness and motivational stuff. And I'm not actively seeking him out. He's appearing on my feed, and there's no real way of kind of seeing anything different. But I think kind of the use of his name in this discourse has kind of flattened the conversation. I think we can dig a lot deeper than that.
It's so interesting. I think that sort of also alludes to Holly's point around how we've sort of portrayed or put expectations of a certain type of masculinity as being the only like acceptable one, or the only one that's sort of deemed as progressive or as being means that you're a good person, which has left a lot of the male population sort of at a loss. So let's go into quickly the now trends. So Here's a quick overview of our now trends. We purposely divided these by gender. So we've got two female-orientated ones, which are trad fantasies and sentimental power, and then two male ones, which is primal masculinity and alpha ideals. Hopefully the names sort of allude to which one's which. We took very like classic color coding in our report as well of pink and blue, and we felt like it was very sort of going backwards, but we wanted to sort of land the point of that these are actually very distinct gender trends. So this is where that surprising conservative streak that we've been mentioning really comes to the fore. So with more and more Gen Z men and women sort of embracing traditional expressions of femininity and masculinity. And that's largely in response to everything that we were just talking about. So, you know, the emerging anxieties, the sort of like pressure to conform to these personas, these sort of growing influence in these aesthetics and these sort of lifestyles, as well as the sort of lack of role models or very few role models for men. So let's go back to seeing our wonderful panelist face. So let's start with tradwives. Tradwives, if tradwives have not entered your algorithm on social media, then I don't know if that's actually a blessing or a curse. It's wild anyway. It's you can watch women in designer clothes literally making cornflakes or bubblegum from scratch with perfect makeup and like in some cases seven children. But anyway, trad wives have been taking over TikTok this last year. So there's been a huge sort of controversy around them. You know, some people have criticized them, say that they're sort of women in retrograde, the end of feminism. And other people are saying, no, it's about romanticizing this feminine leisure and this blissful domesticity. So Emma, what does this tension tell us about how young women are feeling today? And what could it tell us about their future?
Yeah, so as Marina just alluded to, just to define that tension again. So on one side, something like a portrayal of more traditional domesticity feels regressive. It feels potentially dangerous after, you know, how many decades worth of work by feminists to get women out of the home, earning their own income in the public sphere rather than only the domestic sphere. Like this is so regressive. On the other side, as she said, people feel like, oh, this is actually really beautiful thing. This is a return to simplicity. This is potentially more leisurely. So as opposed to the corporate burnout culture that we were all feeling, now we can just like make food for our family or something like this. And I think that there's a way to think about this that isn't that inflammatory on either side, which is just that like it makes sense that people would be looking for meaning in this sphere that has been, at least for the last 5 years, kind of edited out of women's lives, right? There was a lot of messaging, just speaking for myself, that was not a worthy space to seek or find meaning. And so as a reaction to both the corporate girl boss culture and the extended adolescence, the messiness, the lack of responsibility, perhaps it's just is a logical follow that people would be searching for meaning in the home and in the family. And so, you know, I think a lot of times we talk about the draw toward trad wife content, both or as a consumer or as a lifestyle you want to replicate for yourself. The beauty in that is just the simplicity, the leisure, etc. But I also think that it represents a return to understanding of the innate meaning of home and family, and that women are genuinely rediscovering the meaning and purpose that can be found in those spaces. So I don't see it so much as necessarily a regressive or a conservative turn, but just a real search for meaning. And so to Marina's question of like what this might tell us about women, huge question, of course. But
Exactly, just a simple question.
yeah, one thing that it tells me is that people genuinely want to feel purposeful and meaningful. And so, whereas we might have thought a year or two ago, like, oh, actually, zero responsibility, ultimate freedom is ultimate purpose, maybe
Interesting,
we
yeah.
want to feel connected to our family, whether that's your marital spouse or your parents or potentially your children as well. So I think it's just worth opening to the possibility that that the turn towards trad wife content, even at the extremes, is just like a genuine search for meaning and for community.
I think that's a great way of framing it, because I definitely was in the camp of when I first came across this, was like, what have we been working for? What's going on right now? But it's actually, in a lot of ways, it's not that deep. And actually, what you said there really points to one of our future trends, which is about positive parenthood and repositioning parenthood and motherhood, not as like this sort of sacrifice, but as something that can be more fulfilling and in a lot of ways more equal. That's great. Thank you so much, Emma. So I guess quickly, sorry, Emma, one more thing. So in terms of the girlhood trend, we know that sort of peaked in 2023. We've heard a lot that sort of like the girl aesthetic, girlification of everything has sort of reached its peak and lost its momentum. But what imprint do you think this will leave on culture, and particularly Gen Z?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, before I answer that, I want to say one more thing about the domestic space, which is, I think it's also a kind of a return to sensory purpose in a way, which will lead into what we're talking about in the future trends. So, a majority of this content is literally like cooking, cleaning, crafting, which we weren't seeing in this more like corporate, kind of D2C of life that we had in the late 2010s, early 2020s. Anyways, back to your question about extended girlhood and the imprint that will leave on culture. I mean, I think just with a new set of aesthetics, we are still in that. So I'm not sure, later on we might talk about Charlie XCX's new album, Brat, which is like turning into the album and kind of aesthetic palette of summer.
Brat Summer, yeah.
Brat Summer, exactly. And so I think that is, as I said, just swapping out a new set of aesthetics for some of the same principles that we were like seeing on display in Eras Tour, right? So totally new outfits, vibes, slang, everything looks diametrically opposed, but it's actually still this celebration of youthfulness and, to a certain extent, no responsibilities and openness, as well as like girl gangs in a sense, and girls. It just looks a little different.
I think what was also interesting about it though was, I think with Taylor Swift, I mean, I've been fascinated with, I mean, I became a Swiftie in this last year, sort of a latecomer fan, but I feel like in terms of the sort of power, how it proves the power of sort of girl fandoms and girlification, and the fact that, these fandoms and these communities and these spaces are to be taken seriously. We had another expert who was talking about how, male sports fandoms have always been respected and sort of seen as like credible, but girl fandoms have always been kind of like dismissed as being silly. But now I think also part of the sort of girlhood and girlification of last year has shown just actually the credibility of that, and in a way has made it a more open space for men as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also just the actual power of that, which maybe you were alluding to as well, but like that there's like real money to be had in female fandoms.
Exactly. So now let's get the male perspective on stuff. I mean, I feel like I'm in a school teacher. I'm like girls, boys, but let's go into let's go into our trend of primal masculinity. So this essentially indicates a shift from the emotionally sensitive, the progressive sort of man that we've been alluding to, that came out of that sort of resistance, to something a bit more carnal. So Alex, can you tell us a little bit more about the trend? And then I'd love to get Jay's thoughts as well on sort of what's driving Gen Z men towards this archetype of masculinity.
Absolutely, yeah. I want to bring in my fellow representative of masculinity at some point shortly. So yeah, essentially, our trend around primal masculinity looks at how men are returning to kind of their more caveman-like ways. So it can still be in an aspirational manner, and I think kind of it's important to point out that primal masculinity doesn't have to go against kind of progressive trends of the last few years. What it is and what it looks like is, we're seeing a real, change in sport trends. So a real surge towards interest in combat sports, particularly among Gen Z. So an interesting Ernst & Young study last year showed that boxing is the second most popular sport in terms of engagement among Gen Z, which is much higher than its eighth placed ranking, I think, among the general population. MMA is also enjoying a massive surge, in no doubt, due to kind of the influencers that are showing a lot of interest in this space, and also weightlifting as well. And I think we'll come on to talk around how actually some of those combat sports are really massively diversifying across the gender divide as well. And I think, we've talked about that sense of community, belonging, purpose, and I think that's what combat sports are driving as well. This kind of, it's maybe perhaps more individualistic, but it is certainly driving young men's purpose. And kind of beyond that as well, like on a kind of more dietary side of things, is we're seeing this kind of boom in meatfluencers or carnivore influencers. So some of you may be familiar with the meat influencer Eddie Abu on Instagram and on TikTok. He's got around 5 million followers that he's mostly accumulated just in 2024 alone. He kind of talks about being a former bodybuilder and really kind of boiling his diet down to just unseasoned meat and eggs. And I think but he kind of conveys it in a very sort of wholesome way. He's a very kind of lovable character. He's sold out student unions where he's done a lot of kind of talks with young men around motivation. And I think it kind of speaks to maybe the overcomplication of kind of diet culture for men and fitness culture, and that need for something much more kind of simple, however seriously you might take his dietary recommendations. But yeah, I wanted to bring in Jay here. So obviously Jay, kind of in your role with Imagine Insights, constantly monitoring the motivations and drivers of Gen Z men's attitudes. So I wonder what you thought was maybe driving this sort of archetype of masculinity.
Firstly, on the unseasoned meat, I'm Jamaican and there will be no unseasoned meat in my house. I want to clarify that. But yeah, no, appreciate you firstly for having me. And I think with an elastic band, if you pull it for a period of time, eventually it's going to snap back to its original point. I think what happened was, when you look at specifically Gen Z men, they were looking at millennials and kind of watching all the things we were speaking about, how the media was speaking about men, and just like illogical things like let's kill all men, like where are these things coming from, and all these different like narratives that were being played. And what happened was they felt like they were being stretched. And they were saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't be like this, you can't be like that, this is what you should be sensitive, and then it just snaps back. And they were just like, actually, I'm going to be who I think I should be. And what's happened is, and they've taken parts of, and we spoke about Andrew Tate earlier, and they've taken parts of that, but not taken the entire personality. Because I think a lot of the time they've looked at things like that, looked at men like that and gone, actually, that's not who I want to be. But the idea of them doing MMA, or the idea of them doing things that are actually more masculine, quote unquote, masculine, taking those parts and adding those into who they are. And I think one of the things that encourages me though, outside of all of this, is definitely the snap back to that masculinity, but then they're still taking parts of that femininity that is there. So say, for example, looking after your skin. So I love my skincare regime. Like, I swear by it, but I still do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai. I have a couple of fights a year. I look after myself. I ride a motorbike. So I do quote unquote masculine things, but I'm still going to look after my skin. And I've taken that, and I have a sleep routine, and I have a dietary routine with very well seasoned meat. And I think it's having those balances. I think is a lot of Gen Z leaning into it. And because of what I do with the technology that we have, I constantly get to see them answering these questions, being actually, I'm very comfortable in having both my masculine side and being in touch with my feminine side, where I think historically for previous generations, well, I have to be one or the other. I can't be a mixture of both. And with this demographic, they're going, actually, I can be both. And what encourages me is that they're the older siblings of Generation Alpha. And I think for Generation Alpha, will be very much leading to this even more.
So interesting, because our other trend of alpha ideals is sort of the way that men are investing in themselves to sort of present themselves in a way that's like attractive to women. And that's often out of sort of feelings of rejection or social isolation. But we did also mention that Jake Paul came out with a skincare line, which he quoted himself as, "Me and my brother are the testosterone Kardashians," which I was like, that just sums it up perfectly. But yeah, I think that's sort of a perfect example of that mix of this guy who's like the ultimate, dude, YouTuber, boxer, and then also comes out with a skincare line.
And I think actually, just to sort of weave in to that kind of idea of men taking care of themselves with wellness products as well, like another case study we look at in Primal Masculinity is how men are looking after their sperm health as well. So one of the very kind of real concerns that modern men have, which is an argument that filters through to kind of male communities online, is that sperm count is deteriorating, but we're actually seeing kind of a lot of new brands around sort of male reproductive health as well, looking at products that improve kind of fertility support and sperm health among men. And I think that's really interesting that kind of men are actually engaging with that and like, really taking care of themselves in that sense, because, at the
And
same time,
but does that go back to that feeling of wanting to be the alpha male, which ultimately
100%.
like
Yeah,
reproduction is like the ultimate proof of being a successful male, like and like, so it's all those things that essentially makes you the most fit for quite primal things, reproducing, being able to be strong, being like,
And that's so for me. So I train 6 days a week, and I go to the sauna every single day. And one of the things
saunas, such a thing.
my group of friends, they kind of had like an intervention for me about 2 weeks ago, where they sat down and like, yo, bro, we love that you train every day and that you sauna every day, but maybe let's just like pull down the saunas. Let's just sauna a couple of days a week. And when they explained to me about, I had no idea about like sperm count. I was like, whoa. I was like, so I pulled back on the saunas instantly, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do a couple. But it's conversations like that where historically we would just, as men, we would have just let our friends crack on and do whatever. But I had like 4 or 5 guys literally just at the cafe, just sat down and like, bro, we need to have a conversation about sperm health. I was like, yo, chill.
That's the most wholesome intervention, I think.
100%. And I was like, yes, let's go. And I was like, fine, but it's good. And I think but even at my jiu-jitsu gym, it's very open conversations about therapy. Like a lot of the guys have their nails painted, and it's like all these different things that in the gym where historically, but like, how dare you come and talk about that in here? It's now very much more open, and we have those open conversations.
Nice.
So I think it's healthy.
I feel like we could talk forever, so I'm going to move us on to the next trend. Sorry, was that what you were about to do, Holly? Or did I just
No, it wasn't. I was going to add something else.
But add it. It's go on.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, I spoke to a really interesting expert called Joshua Citarella, who was also featured in the report about fertility, or one of the areas he was talking about was fertility health and the fertility crisis that Alex and Jay just mentioned. And that we haven't really talked about the manosphere, and I think we're probably going to go on to that in a minute. But one of the areas or one of the things he was talking about was essentially that there are these kind of pearls of wisdom hidden within the manosphere, within these kind of dark, very demonized spaces, and very demonized mostly by the kind of liberal media, kind of looking down on these areas that kind of young boys are gathering. And actually one of those pearls of wisdom is essentially the manosphere is very tapped into the fertility crisis at a rate that's far exceeding the kind of general public. So it does feel like that is a real driver to why a lot of these men in these spaces are maybe turning to some of these more kind of quote unquote primal protective forms of testosterone fueled masculinity, when they are also kind of very tapped into what's going on in fertility right now. Back to the schedule.
Sorry. Actually, well, we can sort of switch things around a bit, because I think that's actually quite a good gateway into talking about sort of positive male role models. But quickly, just wanted to give you an overview of our next trends. So we've reported on 7 trends, which are all about the alliance. So this is really focusing on how to bring like Gen Z men and women together. And we found that a lot of it's around hobbies, collective spaces, also sort of rebranding or repositioning traditions. And all of these things are key to establishing commonality and empathy between the sexes, and which will ultimately lead to a more unified future. So let's get sort of on that note, Holly, let's talk about sort of role models. So Jay, you've spoken about this like dearth of positive male role models for young men of this generation, but you did mention the sort of, on the positive side though, there's much more openness for young people to seek self-improvement. So, we've been seeing things like fashion and fitness tips from relatable people that they can trust. So one of our trends is peer advisors, which was very much inspired by our conversation with you and other things that we were seeing. But could you talk a little bit more about who these peer advisors are and why you think this is sort of an exciting shift for young people?
Yeah, I think a few years ago there was real talk around like micro influencers and folks like that. And I think with a micro influencer, you almost know you're an influencer. You know that you're trying to like, hey, I'm trying to have this effect. I'm going to focus on fashion, blah, blah, blah. But then with um these peer advisors, it's more of just normal folk that are just like, you know what, I'm obsessed with X, and I'm just going to talk about X, but it's not going to be like, it's just going to be around like food or training, or whatever it may be, whatever that person's thing is. They talk about it, but in a way that's not, they're not trying to be like salesy with it. They're not trying to be an influencer with it. And I think a lot of the time with the peer advisors, it's definitely both on socials, but also in your actual group, and looking within their friendship group and being like, actually around me, I'm very much influenced about how my friends are engaging in certain activities, and that's actually going to inform more of what I do than actually a larger influence. Because I think historically we went through a period where, specifically for millennials, it was very much like what so and so, what the Hadid say or what the Kardashians say is more important to me than X. But now it's leaning more towards, actually, I trust my friendship group. I'm close to my friendship group, and if they're doing jujitsu, I want to try jujitsu. Like a lot of my friends have started training in the last 6 months because they're like, I want to compete, I want to do these things, and they're seeing each other doing it. And you're definitely seeing that within this demographic where they're very happy with going, I'm going to follow somebody that really cares about this. They're a smaller quote unquote influencer, and my friends around me are also obsessed as well.
I think one thing that we found, which we found really actually quite sort of interesting and like nice, was actually we were seeing like a lot of like women sort of advising or giving recommendations to men, and sort of and vice versa. It felt like there was a breaking down of that sort of like segregated gender advice space in a way. So we were saying, Holly, do you want to talk a bit about some of the like TikTok accounts and the series that we had reported on with regards to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because when we were looking at the manosphere and the kind of drivers behind, why men were going to these spaces, it was because of, self-improvement, and the intentions were good. The men were looking to, like we were saying, either become more attractive to women because they realized they wanted a relationship, or they wanted a marriage or something like that. But then also they wanted better mental health, they wanted better physical health, they wanted better friendships, and they were kind of having this dearth of advice or spaces where they could go to look for that. So it's interesting because we started to see the new shows and new content and things like that were about kind of helping men be better, but without having this sort of patronizing, kind of infantilizing man-child approach, which I think has been very popular in the last like 10 years, of kind of very much normalized by Instagram and dating culture, and kind of really position, I don't know, all of these, the ick culture, and men having a mattress,
men are useless, and they're children. Yeah.
Exactly. The ceiling light and no lamps, and like, not having a skincare regime, whatever it is. Like the approach was always like kind of patronizing men rather than trying to maybe help them do better. So yeah, we saw some really interesting shows, one of which is called Boy Room, which is a TikTok show where this woman, who I think is also a female comedian, goes into spaces of boys' bedrooms, and they are actually, mattress on the floor, no lamp vibes, but instead of kind of poking fun at them, she actually tries to help them. And there is a kind of lighthearted humor behind it, but she finishes the episode with like imagining what it could be like. So being like, oh, you've actually got really nice natural light here, so I would maybe like move this or like put this here. It's like a kind of mini like home improvement show for like 21-year-old boys.
And what was interesting about that too was she was also like talking about how, there's so much pressure on women to sort of be the homemaker, in the sense of like there's just this expectation to have, your home set up and sort of done nicely, and letting men see the effort and the sort of pressure that goes behind that was also a way to create empathy on the other side. So in a way, it was helping both genders be like, look, it's a lot of work to do this, and this is the sort of pressure, but also it does make you feel better, and this is how I can help. So as a way, it was sort of a even level sort of transfer of knowledge, insight. Yeah.
Totally. And even rejecting, I think she made a point actually I think we both read the same day's article where they interviewed her, which was really, really interesting. She talked about how brand algorithms and like advertising marketing algorithms can actually play a part here, which is interesting because again, like, you know, a lot of the people attending this webinar will be from brands or marketers, and they'll be like, what do I do with this? Which hopefully we'll come on to in a minute. But I think one of the ways is like, when we think about algorithms and marketing, when we know that women are more likely to buy, let's say, homeware products, it's very easy to therefore market homeware products to women, or, you know, recognize that that is where you're going to have the most buyers, and therefore like it creates this kind of feedback loop where only women buy homeware. But actually there is an opportunity here to start targeting your adverts differently and maybe counterintuitively to what you would initially think, and therefore it just kind of breaks out of that loop and inspires more men to buy skincare products or women to buy hammers or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and just as sort of Jay was saying, in terms of it's that form of masculinity, which is also incorporating, you know, different aspects of more like feminine traits, skincare, nails, that it's about blending those two things. And I think we mentioned it in our trends report too, sort of the revival of blue collar and how that industry and those jobs are actually becoming sort of more inclusive space where it's not just that view of sort of toxic masculinity and machoism. It's actually there's a lot of room for both men and women. So I've just looked at time. I want to quickly talk about one thing that we've really found is that sort of activities, hobbies, sort of shared passions is a really big way to bring Gen Z men and women together. So a huge area that we've been noticing this in is sports and fitness. So Emma, your podcast actually recently pivoted to explore the body. So I think that's, even though our trend sort of talks about embodiment and this sort of how we've been our digital selves and now we want to sort of return to our physical body. But maybe if we just touch a little bit on the sort of how we're seeing these different sports spaces becoming more mixed gendered and sort of, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, as Marina said, it's all is under the umbrella of a return to the body, physical sensation, sensory pleasures, etc., some of which we've already talked about. But yeah, I actually think everything that Jay was just talking about around working out, whether if it's MMA or weightlifting or something else, like that directly feeds into this. So we've obviously been seeing so many headlines in the past year or so about the phenomenon of weightlifting just as a trend, and specifically for women. So obviously there's been science to show that resistance training is one of the best things that you can do for your body now and as you age, but there's this huge resurgence to getting both men and women critically into the gym to strength train, which is really exciting. Got a couple of other examples around like sports and athletics specifically. So one thing that's been pretty exciting to see here in the States is the explosion of the WNBA. So, you know, partially that was fueled by this kind of convenient media discourse around Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, this like obvious rivalry that was really played into. But if you look at like the WNBA draft this year was the most watched like of all time and nearly doubled the past record. So major new interest in women's sports, which we haven't seen like ever, at least not of late. So that is pretty cool. This is shifting a little bit, though sometimes somewhat related. If you look at a brand like Skims, which, you know, obviously for all of the like inherent heft that Kim Kardashian has behind her name and around anything she does, it makes sense that her brand would be successful. But Skims marketing is doing so much that to directly target fitness, physique, and sports. So that obviously they partnered with the NBA and the WNBA just the other week. They came out as a sponsor of Team USA for the Olympics coming up, what, later this month or early August? I don't know when the
Yeah, end of July.
End of July. Okay. Yeah. So I'm just seeing a ton of interest, not only in physique, hygiene that we've already talked about, but actually in sports, athletics, and play. So I think it's really exciting, both just to get women re-involved in the pursuit of sports and fitness and athletics, because that, you know, a female athlete hasn't necessarily been manifestation of femininity that has been celebrated. So that's cool just to even see them involved. And then, as you were saying, also is an opportunity for a place of togetherness. I look at my gym now and it's like, that's actually a kind of rare space other than like a bar where men and women are both coming together on pretty earnest terms to improve themselves and like be in a shared space. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting space overall.
Yeah, and I think that was one thing that we were really excited about as we were doing these trends was how, you know, sort of traditionally male-owned space or female-owned space are now opening up to the opposite sex and sort of welcoming and becoming now cross-gendered. Like one of our Trans Sisterhood 2.0, we do talk about how, like, you know, we had these before, you know, these like female utopians, whether it was like the female-only club. But essentially, there wasn't longevity to that. You know, you can't just hide away from men. Even though I did feel personally attacked by the end of the girls' girl because I feel like I lived by that as a millennial. But it's not the end of the girls' girl. It's the broadening of the girls' girl and welcoming boys in as well. But yeah, I think it feels like there's a sort of coming together, and opening of spaces, which will in turn sort of open conversations and also sort of break down, I think, boundaries and barriers and also misunderstandings. So I know that we've talked a lot about a bunch of different things and sort of we could, as you can see, we could speak about this topic for hours on end. And I understand that it can be hard for businesses to know where to join this conversation. So in our report, we've actually set out 3 steps for brands to take action. So it's all about reframing, firstly, optimizing, and then decentering gender. So in terms of reframing and optimizing, it's about not only sort of putting that expectation or that pressure to fulfill one type of masculinity or femininity, realizing the nuances in it, and also celebrating and finding those positive sort of nuggets within each form or expression of masculinity and femininity. So as we sort of mentioned with the manosphere, you know, despite all of the negative and toxic elements to it, there's actually a lot of positive sentiments and underlying intentions when it comes to self-improvement or when it comes to sort of finding belonging, or in terms of the more traditional sort of trad wife, you know, it's all about being more pro-choice, like accepting that you can slow down or that you can be fulfilled by motherhood or you don't need to have to try and strive for it all. So we outline a lot of different things like that. And then finally, decentering gender. So how you can actually bring the genders together and how you can actually sort of put values and purpose and this sense of belonging, which is so important to Gen Z, at the core of your messaging and of your services and of your products, so that you're not necessarily just targeting them as a gender, but as a person. So just going to see in terms of questions, let me I see one. Let me read it first. Why don't we, as I do that, Holly and Alex, so what key recommendation would you give to a brand? So let's make it more tangible for everyone listening.
Yeah, sure. I can kick off. Actually, I'm just gonna build on that idea of those mixed gender moments that we briefly touched upon, because I think there's a lot more of this to unpack and there's a lot more in the report around this. But I think this is a really key area where we can like physically like create spaces for this, you know, in this kind of society of like what feels like quite segregated spaces between men and women, because it's not just the gym. I think the gym is a really great space that men and women are coming together, but there's also really interesting things happening in like the dating sphere, because it feels there's been so many reports recently that have shown that Gen Z have like really fallen out of favor with swipe culture, dating apps, everything like that. And it's increasingly shaped how they've seen the opposite sex, in terms of they don't feel like they have friendships with the opposite sex anymore, because they only see them in this kind of dating capacity, which is very kind of formulaic and very kind of goal driven in some sort of way. But actually, when we were speaking to our Gen Z expert Use, he was talking about chess clubs. So he actually runs a space in East London, or is part of a space that called Bobo's, which we feature in the report, which runs chess clubs. And he says that's been a really great space for boys and girls in their early 20s to come together and make friends with one another, because so many of them when they've kind of gone, maybe they've like had opposite sex friendships at university or at school, but now they found themselves in the workplace or whatever it is, they've kind of gone back into their group. So this is actually a space where they can have these organic friendships which build week on week. So it's not about, okay, over one night we're going to kind of connect. It's like, oh no, you can drop in on a weekly basis. It's kind of that, it's creating those organic spaces for those interactions to flourish slowly rather than trying to kind of force them you know, on a kind of one-on-one date or whatever it might be. So I think breaking down that boundary between kind of dating and friendship is going to be really key for brands to be doing in coming years.
And so is that for brands to sort of create those opportunities and sort of play into those spaces and facilitate those sort of, of like coming together? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So the question actually is mainly to Jay. So Jay, maybe have a quick read of it. It's in the chat, but it's around the sort of listening to your peers and engaging with sort of and trusting their opinion. So maybe just have a read of that. And then in the meantime, Alex, why don't you tell us about what your key recommendation would be?
Yeah, so I think I'd probably actually be coming back to some of the stuff that Jay talked around peer advisors, and there's so much positivity and aspiration to be found in the everyday nowadays. So, you know, the fact that we have moved away from maybe kind of high status role models and more towards kind of, finding inspiration in our peers. So, as Jay talked about, kind of, you know, there are ordinary people with, you know, a few hundred followers online that are just deeply passionate about their own interests. So whether that's you know, whether that's a particular sport or that's kind of pottery making, whatever that is. And you know, Gen Z have really shown that they're willing to kind of make those connections organically themselves online. So I think just kind of thinking about like brand ambassadors and just kind of campaigns and how you kind of play into Gen Z's aspirations. I think it's to sort of think about the real young people and the relatable experiences that they're having, kind of around style, around fitness, around self-improvement, and not necessarily kind of thinking about the kind of the next big name. Because if we put a gender lens on this as well, I think, you know, one thing that we've really learned from some of our interviews is that much of Gen Z, at least kind of from the masculine perspective, you know, they don't really engage in this masculinity or femininity discourse, kind of that everyday Gen Z on the street. They just kind of act it out, and everyone kind of has their own version of masculinity, their own version of femininity, and so excessive emphasis on those terms or on how to perform those particular you know, behaviors or however you want to phrase it, you know, can be part of the kind of aspect that's alienating these audiences. So yeah, I think just to kind of root those campaigns, root those kind of those messages in the everyday person.
Yeah, super interesting. Before we get into your response, Jay, we got another question about sort of the rise of the idea of the gender non-binary and crossing of gender boundaries. So we maybe should have mentioned at the outset, but this is very much a sort of like heterosexual cis sort of view on masculinity and femininity. So in terms of with non-binary and sort of the LGBTQIA plus expressions and sort of performances of gender, we sort of left that out because that obviously is a entirely different story. And actually felt like in a lot of ways, this story, we actually mention and report on this, how there's been a lot of like hetero pessimism over the last few years, and a lot of sort of like, I don't know, shame with being hetero and sort of having those like cis gender identities. And again, sort of this point around acceptance of whatever the gender expression is. So that's why we only focused on masculinity and femininity in that context. Let me know if that didn't answer your question or not. And Jay, are you okay to answer the other one?
It was a long piece of copy, so I appreciate you, Sakina, for the message. But yeah, I think the tool that comes to mind for me would be Reddit, and the reason for that is actually it's a very conversational tool, and I think the challenges, and someone mentioned actually in the comment below around if you're on TikTok, it can become like an echo chamber. So the other day on my TikTok, so I do an outfit TikTok, and on there I commented around politics and the need for people to go out and vote. And my TikTok was just flooded with people just saying vote reform, da, 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 da," and it was just crazy. But once it began, you couldn't stop it, and it was just like the comments were just flooded with thousands of people saying it. And that echo chamber is definitely there on TikTok. It can definitely be there on Twitter. But when you go onto Reddit, because it's more of a conversational tool, you see it much less, and you can see two sides actually trying to have a discourse. And you'll see an overarching like theme or trending in one direction, but there's definitely more of a discourse happening in there, which I think is great. And I think that's why Reddit has seen a massive resurgence in the last few years, where probably about, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, it was people were saying, oh, it's dying out, so on and so on. But in the last couple of years, you've seen Reddit really, really take off again as a trusted source, which is really cool. But outside of all of that, you definitely see people having very honest conversations and being able to actually, if you see a video and you disagree with it, you just repost that and then talk about your view on top of it and enabling that conversation to happen. I definitely think that's happening more and more, without a doubt. So from a platform perspective, those are the two that come to mind for me.
Amazing. I just looked at the time and we've gone over by 1 minute. So I'm going to have to cut us off. But thank you so much to our amazing panelists for all of their energy, their invaluable input. We've truly only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to find in the report, and we could talk about this for days. So the report, again, just as a reminder, will be available to download from next Tuesday, the 9th of July, and there also will be a recording to the webinar. But please get in touch with either Alex or I if you want to sort of talk about anything in more detail. We love to do personalized tours of trends or sort of think about what the specific implications would be for your business or your category. So yeah, get in touch. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Maria.
you. Bye.